Evening. I'm a dairy farmer. I've been in rural Y for about 30 years. I don't know if a lot of you guys know me a lot. Some do. I've got some friends here. Absolutely love Northland. It's an awesome, awesome place. And quite often we actually don't get recognised outside of what goes on in a lot of the urban cities. So I just want to talk to you quickly about what's going on in the rural industry. I'm sure some of you are farmers here. Shortened version of it. There's been a real evisceration of where we sit inside of rural New Zealand. We've been excoriated quite often in the media. A lot of my farming colleagues here feel every day, being a cow cocky in rural New Zealand, being a sheep and beef owner, being a grower, it's all getting harder. And we're acutely aware of it. Sadly, this is a runaway problem and we need to arrest it. Now, I was going to go on and on and on about some of the other policies, but we've got a small audience, so we'll actually just engage in the real reality of what we're struggling with. I would like to talk to you just quickly about the ETS, the methane framework, the billion tree reality, the freshwater initiative. Gracious me, let's talk about the pugging down in South Island, which has now got a prosecutorial reality out of Labour. It's an egregious bit of policy. So looking through the lens of rural New Zealand, we're big exponents as the ACT Party of actually getting government out of your way. Because the first thing I want to say to most people that are farming in rural New Zealand, anywhere, not just Dargaville, could be the Wairarapa, could be the bottom of the deep south of the South Island. We're bloody good people, New Zealand farmers, and I don't think we actually get the oratory and the support from central government. Our dear old national friends who used to be the support network for rural New Zealand have gone off on a holiday for certainly 2 or 3 election cycles. So when we're talking about rural New Zealand and where we sit on it, the billion tree program's a cracker of a bit of legislation that we're now looking at. We've got a subsidised reality where the current government's exponent is, in the form of Shane Jones, is perpetuating this narrative of throw a billion trees in. Well, where do they go? You know, by conservative estimates, the Conservation Department have said, and you can all do a bit of digging around on Google, there's some 200 million trees in native conservation land. Well, where do a billion go? This is the first question I asked. And more importantly, when the billion trees go in, it's a subsidised reality. Where do the small communities go? You know, we've all got small kindies, local schools, a student body, the local motorcycle man, all the small businesses that are the metaphorical grease in the wheel of rural New Zealand. That evaporates. Just quickly talk about the freshwater initiative. Like again, rural New Zealand is getting this vitriolic language out of the current government. It's farcical. Us Kiwi farmers around New Zealand, and a lot of guys don't actually know this, have done 50,000 k's of fence. Now, I've done a bit of oratory on social media. I don't profess to be a very good public speaker, but I do my best. Well, they got 20,000 views from our country folk. To be quite candidly, they've had a guts full of it. You know, 54,000 k's of fence. This is our own hard effort. It's not acknowledged. That's a fair way to the moon. And when you actually tie that into a reality, that's the equivalent of hundreds, if not, you know, well, let's talk about tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of personal investment. Current government doesn't acknowledge it. I pushed back, the ACT Party pushed back on this visceral language that was coming out of Labour about the pugging. Now, Minister O'Connor referenced this pugging issue as if somehow that was a tangible reality to stop a 500-kilo animal being driven by the wind and sheets of rain and or snow. Then you had a council reality down in the deep south. Obviously, this is all salient to the cropping reality, that you had a prosecutorial reality where council could come on farm. Well, that's erosion of our rights. The simple fact is, farmers are their own best conservationists. It's not inherent upon us to actually destroy our own land. We're also acutely aware as farmers, we've actually got to look after our livestock. I mean, one chap said to me, well, the bloody cows shouldn't, and the farmers shouldn't be there. Well, they are there. Let's have an honest conversation about ways to mitigate the problem. Now, I don't know to sort of, I'll try and contextualise it for you. There are 100 wastewater plants in New Zealand run by regional councils, 100, that currently don't meet compliance in terms of faecal coliforms that go into natural watercourses, 100. Now, this, you know, I'm not banging on, I'm going to take pointed fingers at urban New Zealand, but farmers are not the great harbingers of environmental doom. We're simply not. When you talk about this 100 wastewater treatment plant, having consents to discharge, a lot of that was pre-RMA in 1991. So they've got an open slather to discharge because they have to in adverse weather events, and you get a councillor jump the farm fence and you're metaphorically bloody in jail when you have a few animals jump the farm fence. So we've got to fix it. Certainly big on the right oratory. We need the right oratory in government where we find tailored solutions. We are going to, as the ACT Party, repeal and replace the RMA. It's a 900-page document. I'm sure many governments, including the recent 9-year stint by National, advocated it. They didn't do it. It doesn't allow for the fluidity of getting things done. You know, the RMA in rural New Zealand or urban New Zealand, anywhere, in any capacity, is this big onerous document, and it stops progress. I mean, far out, we can't even build a paddling pool in rural New Zealand without getting bloody told off. Now, that's just madness. We've got to repeal it and replace it with a reality that allows for getting things done. And in rural New Zealand, that's half the issue that we have. Now, just quickly before I hand over to my esteemed colleagues, far more than I have of well, clever people, I just want to touch on the SME thing. I don't know how many guys here have their own small businesses in town, and it ties up with the reality of farming in the provincial New Zealand in the rural space. The current economy in the COVID reality is going to contract by about 10%. Now, that's deeply concerning. Current government is on its spray and walk away reality of $140 billion spent. They're committed to borrowing this, and it's now incumbent upon not all of us, but just including all of us, the next generation, to pay that back by way of debt. So if I was to frame that for you and put that into a context, that's $18.3 billion in interest every year between now and 2030, by way of interest alone on that $140 billion borrowed. Now, that's actually more than the current government spends on the entire education program. Now, that's a deep concern for us. Now, you know, both Simon and Nicole here can sort of touch on that further, but the simple fact is, it's not sustainable. We need a more fluid approach to fixing the COVID reality we're all in. If you go to the official ACT website, you can see our 5-point plan. We've got to get back to business. And not only myself, but my colleagues here are deeply concerned that the current framework out of the Labor government isn't working. So, yeah, given the small audience, I actually won't go on for too much longer because I think I want to hand over to Nicole here if I can. She's a very good exponent, been an outspoken person protecting the rights of farm owners, and is acutely aware of how their rights also have been eviscerated by the current government. So thank you very much, guys. I'll leave it with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Nicole McKee. I flew up from windy Wellington this morning. I'd like to say thanks for not having the wind up here. It's a nice relief. Actually, it's really great to be here. I don't get to visit the far north very much, but I am Ngāpuhi. I whakapapa back to Whatatiri, Pipiwai and Rawhiti as well, so it's nice to be back around this area. And hopefully I'll get some whānau, might turn up to some events as well. So thank you all for coming along tonight. I have a few roles that I will be speaking in. Tonight I just want to touch on firearms, hunting and conservation, but also welfare. And just picking up from some of the discussion that Mark just had with you, you know, we have these small businesses that could potentially be going under. And what's become quite alarming is when we look at the number of people that are on welfare. So pre-COVID, there were 300,000 people requiring a benefit of some sort. And as at June 2020, that had increased to 350,000. Newspapers have been reporting an extra 70,000 so far. And by the end of the year, if we keep having lockdowns, we can see how much that's going to increase. So ACT has a plan where we want to help those businesses and those people that are in employment. If they end up needing welfare assistance, we need to change the way that welfare is working at the moment so that we can grab the people that need that assistance and give them something meaningful to help them survive while they look for more jobs. So part of what we want to introduce is an employment insurance scheme. And this means that we would take taxes that you already pay, 0.55% of it, ring fence it and put it into an employment insurance scheme. So that if you have worked for a year, you would be entitled to 1 week of your employment wages or salary. You'll be entitled to get 55% of that for 1 week out of every 5 that you've worked, up to a maximum of $60,000 and up to a maximum of 6 months. So what that means is if you do find yourself in a situation where you've been unemployed or perhaps you get part-time work here and there, that for every 1 week that you work in every 5, you'd be entitled to 55% of your wage, not the flat rate of welfare, which is $251 a week. Because ACT recognises that those people that have been in employment usually have higher outgoings and we need to support them. But you also deserve to have put back into your pockets exactly what you put into the system in the first place, something that's a bit more fairer. So I just wanted to touch on that because Mark had picked up on some of the aspects of the small businesses that are really struggling at the moment. And if we keep having these lockdowns, that's just going to get worse. I now will move on to hunting and conservation. This is one of my babies that I asked for, and I'm quite proud to be a part of it. When I sat down with the crew and we talked about our policy, you know, there were so many things that this latest government have changed that is detrimental to all of New Zealand. It's not just about hunting. It's about everything to do with our public estate land, which is currently being controlled and manipulated by a government who is only interested in their flora and their fauna at the expense of everything else. They haven't appreciated the wildlife that we have here in New Zealand. They don't care about it. So another one of ACT's policies is to look at making sure that the likes of the Game Animal Council are fully funded to be able to complete their statutory obligations. They have been struggling over the last term with having finance turned off so that they can't actually do their role. And this has made it really, really hard for them. And of course, the rest of New Zealand will be looking at them thinking, why do we have a Game Animal Council? They don't do anything. They actually do a lot, and they have the capability of doing much more. We need to be able to support them so that they can have that voice on behalf of New Zealanders and the hunters and the trampers that are out there as well. But at the moment, they're just being left out. In fact, all the stakeholders are just being left out, especially when it comes to wildlife management. When it gets to the point that our organisations have to take to court the government, take them to the High Court in order to be heard, and you have the High Court judge tell the government they need to have a meaningful discussion with the stakeholders, and they don't, then we know that we've got some serious issues. And we also know that things need to change. So the ACT Party are very keen to make sure we do make those changes, that we do support organisations and the identities that are out there to help protect our flora, our fauna, and our wildlife. We have generations of people here that not only farm, but they also hunt. And especially in the rural areas where people are struggling, we have hunters out there who go out there to hunt to put food on their table. It's exactly what I did for my family. I'm a mother of 4. married, but when my husband decided to go back to university and study, and I was an at-home mum, the only way we could put food on the table is if I went out and hunted. And so I did that over a period of 9 years. He would study for a year, work for a year, study for a year. He was doing his law degree. He's a builder. I'm just going to say, after 9 years, I learned how to put food on the table. My husband got his law degree, and he's still a builder. However, I learned a new skill or two, so that's pretty good. And my kids now realise how good venison tastes, especially the fallow. But that was an opportunity that I have, and it's an opportunity that my children should have, and their children should have. It's something that we are really in New Zealand to be able to do. I went for a hunting day with a colleague of mine. She's an American, and we jumped in the truck. We went over to the Wairarapa. We shot a red deer each. We stuck it on the back of the truck. We drove back home. And as I drove past Parliament with the guns and the deer in the back of the truck, I started laughing. She said, "What are you laughing at?" And I said, "How great is it, mate," because she's American, that you can wake up in the morning, jump in your truck, go over the hill, shoot a couple of deer, and then drive past Parliament on your way back home. You can do it all in a day. Aren't we lucky? The ACT Party appreciates that. The ACT Party are saying we need to be able to keep doing that. And this is one of the reasons why we're all sitting here before you tonight, because we are losing so many of our fundamental rights as New Zealand citizens that have to our whenua, and our ability to go out there and provide for our own families. And none of our children should have that taken away from them by a government who wants to make sure the plants are there instead of the animals. We need to change that. So we are going to support the organisations to be a part of the conversation with the Department of Conservation, to be a part of the conversation with Walking Access Trust, to be able to have a community involvement so we can continue doing what we have legally and rightfully been doing for as long as I can remember, and much before my time. So I hope that you will support us in that task as well. I'm not going to start on the Himalayan tar because I'll really get going on that one. But what I will say is it's another of power. When somebody can come in and say, we are just going to get rid of all of this tar because of the plants, instead of realising the economic benefits that the tar has for the west coast of the South Island and the rest of New Zealand. But that will keep me going all night. I'm just going to move into firearms now. We've had a lot of things happen over the last 18 months, and it didn't need to. And it's going to start with a terrorist attack. That did not need to happen. And there's a lot of theories out there about what went wrong. I think most of us have heard of them. We have a lot of questions. How on earth did a foreign national come into New Zealand and get a license so quickly, and then be able to go and purchase ammunition so quickly? When the alarm bells were ringing with other people in the community, why were the alarm bells not ringing with the officials that were meant to be looking after this? So then we had a guy come in here, he committed an atrocious attack, one that made New Zealand lose its innocence. And me as a firearms licence holder, along with 250,000 other licence holders, mourned that day the loss of innocence in New Zealand. But within a very short period of time, we became the target, the new target, for a government who decided that they needed to make changes and make them quickly. I still cannot understand exactly why they moved so quickly. There was a moratorium put in place to stop people from purchasing and selling AR-15s, and that moratorium was in place until June 2020. But the government decided that it was going to be better for them to actually push through a law and do it in 11 days so that they can say they beat Australia, not taking into account those that legitimately need to use semi-automatic firearms. It's been and gone, done and dusted. They've been banned. The ones that have been collected have been destroyed. But the way that the process occurred has agitated and angered many people out there. In fact, quite a number of non-licensed owners have approached me and said they don't like the way that we were treated. They don't like how the finger was pointed at us and we were made to blame, especially when this is a sector of society that were also mourning the deaths that were unnecessarily, those lives that were unnecessarily taken down in Christchurch. Our next tranche of legislation that came through was an order in council, and that banned certain types of ammunition, and they did it without compensation. So now not only did we have certain types of firearms being taken, but we also had property confiscated that was legally purchased, in some cases purchased from the government through the military, so we paid tax on it, and then just taken away without any repayment. We have done nothing wrong. We purchased it legally, we owned it legally, and now all of a sudden we're not fit enough to have it. After this, we had the next, or what we call the second tranche of legislation, the Arms Legislation Act 2020, that went through in June. Another piece of legislation pushed through very, very quickly. The problem is the select committee were not able to adequately hear everybody around the country and their concerns because they pushed it through so quickly. I was at that time with an organisation that spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to go through that bill. And when we did, we found so many mistakes, so many things in there that we just thought, this is a complete mess. But lo and behold, it went through. The difference was we had David Seymour standing up for the firearm owners. The man doesn't even shoot guns, doesn't know anything about guns. But what he has is principles. And what he saw was that we were losing our right to be heard. We were being blamed for something that we did not do. We were having things taken from us that we had legally purchased. It was being done quickly and it wasn't being done right. And he stood up for us. 119 votes to 1. I realised then when I watched him do that, that I needed to learn a little bit more about what this guy was on about, because that was pretty principled and I really liked it. When he started standing up for other things that were happening as well, how many votes, guys, were 119 to 1? I realised the ACT Party have principles that I can relate to, that I believe in, and that I want to be a part of. So in our discussions about the Arms Legislation Act, and hey, Nicole, if you come on board, what's some ideas that we've got there? Our number 6 candidate, James McDowell, pistol shooter, he and I sat down and we went through, came up with some, what we think is a really great firearms policy, and I'd like to share it briefly with you tonight. One of the first things that we want to do, one of our priorities, is to repeal the Arms Legislation Act 2020. That's the one that just came through in June. And the reason why we want to repeal that one, and why we may just be a little bit lucky with it if we do get to a position where we can negotiate with an upcoming government, is because the National Party did not vote for the Arms Legislation Act 2020 either. I don't believe that all of the other parties were convinced that it was the right thing to do. And the reason why I don't believe that is because they were sitting in the select committee listening to all the mistakes that were in it. What we have, guys, is a piece of legislation called the Arms Act 1983. And if you liken that act to, say, a bicycle wheel, okay, so we've got a tyre, it's the Arms Act 83, on this bicycle wheel. And every time something happens, we get a puncture in the tyre. And then a new amendment is slapped on it to try and fix it. After the Arms Legislation Act 2020, we have had such a severe puncture in that tyre that the integrity of the whole bicycle is now compromised. So the ACT Party would like to repeal that Arms Legislation Act 2020, and then once the Royal Commission inquiry results come out, yes, that's right, we will wait for the Royal Commission inquiry results to come out, we will then start to build a new piece of legislation that takes the good bits out of the original Arms Act 83 and some of the other amendments and put it together, creating a whole new Arms Act. Because what we have now, and there's no amendment to the mistakes made in the Arms Legislation Act 2020 that's going to fix that tyre. The whole wheel is shot now, like my pun. So if we do this, we need to do it with some expertise, and firearm owners are the experts. They're the ones that can tell us what they need, why they need it, and how much of it that they need. The farmers, the shooters, the target shooters, the sports people, the rabbit shooters, the wallaby shooters, they all need to tell us, the pest controllers, New Zealand Deerstalkers Association, the Department of Conservation, the Game Animal Council, they all need to be a part of this legislation. We need it to be a real piece of consultative work, because that's what we did back in the 1980s. It took 2 years to get a piece of legislation that lasted us 36 years. We've done it before, we can do it again. One word helps us get there. It's called consultation, and the ACT Party knows how to go about doing that. So why do we want to repeal the Arms Legislation Act 2020 and nothing else? Why are we just going after that? Because that's the one that has the most mistakes in it. This piece of arms legislation loses a firearms licence owner's rights to remain silent. Now that's a fundamental right that we have. If you're being questioned by police on a matter, you have the right to remain silent. But if you're a firearms owner being questioned on a firearms matter, you have now lost that right. We've lost the ability to go and confidently speak to our doctors about any mental health issues that we may be feeling with. Was detailed have a firearms licence, and if there's any concerns that they may have about your welfare, then they are obliged to tell police about it. So all we can see is that two issues here. One, people are going to not go and visit their doctor and get the help that they may need. And two, rural communities, so many of them don't have doctors. There's locums that come through. So it's making it really hard for the licensed firearm owners, the legal people who've done nothing wrong. I'm one of them. I've represented New Zealand in 2 different sports, 2 different shooting disciplines. I'm married. I'm a mum of 4. I've never been arrested. I've never been charged with anything. But if I do, from now on, get charged with an offence where I could go to jail for 3 months or more, my licence will be revoked. I don't need to be convicted. I just need to be charged. My licence will be revoked for 10 years. I will not be able to apply for another licence for 10 years, and I can't shoot under the supervision of another person for 10 years. What have I done? Especially if I'm found guilty. This means that a gang member with a patch on his back has more rights than a licensed firearm owner, and yet we are the ones that have been vetted by New Zealand Police. I'm a target shooter, I'm a pistol shooter, I'm a small bore shooter. I do the lot, I love it, I get right into it. I have met so many people in my community that are great, fun-loving, responsible Kiwis, and I'm being treated harder than a gang member. The ACT Party sees this, and we need to stop this. But I think one of the things that really irks me as well over all of this is the confiscation of property that I have legally purchased and I'm not being compensated for. And again, when you have an organisation that takes the government to court over that issue, and the High Court judge says, yep, I agree, you should not have been treated like that, you were or should have been eligible for compensation, but I can't overturn it because Parliament is supreme. When that sort of stuff starts happening, then you need a political party to come into the realm to start shaking the house. Because quite frankly, that is not a House of Representatives when they're not listening to the people. So I've put my hat in the ring, along with everybody else, to join this great team. Because as far as I'm concerned, the ACT Party are the only ones that stick to their principles, that have a plan for all of the policies that we want to implement, have a way forward, have a reason to do this. But to do it, we need your help. We need you to give us your party vote. We need you to convince your friends and your families and your colleagues to also give us your party vote, so that when we get in the House on October the 17th, we're in the House of Representatives representing you and your story and your needs. So I hope you help us get there. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nicole. Good evening. Just a moment. So, hi. My name's Simon. I'm the ACT Environment Spokesman. I'm also the ACT candidate for Te Ātatu in West Auckland. I'm a civil and environmental engineer. I'm a father of 3 teenage boys who are all at high school. In my 24 years as a civil engineer, I've led teams in construction and operations and maintenance and on landfills. And, that involves state highways and local roads. I spent 3 years at Auckland Council, and during that time I managed their closed landfill asset portfolio. And I also had an opportunity, because of my wide range of engineering experiences, to get involved with some really difficult projects where council CEOs and different departments had just run out of ideas. So I was asked to give advice on selling and buying contaminated land, for example, and how you deal with really difficult problems like old landfills where we've built housing subdivisions to within 50 metres of the edge of rubbish. So I've seen some really difficult problems. I've seen how they can be solved badly, but I've also seen how organisations with spending the right amount of time and effort can solve some really difficult problems. I've also seen it firsthand, the waste and the inefficiency at central and local government. And that combination of poor management and really bad regulations that favours local councils and government over the needs of private landowners and business. Those environmental rules that are simply activist slogans are dressed up as policy. And when you turn those environmental rules that are activism and slogans into actual laws, then that imposes huge costs on the economy. So we've seen that with different councils declaring climate emergencies, and we've also seen that with our government banning the oil and gas industry and exploration for new resources. And believe me, I've got another example coming to a town near you. So look, what I'm going to tell you about this evening are things that that are going to present a different vision of what New Zealand could be like, and they're ideas that we believe could only come from ACT. They're ideas and policies which ACT believes will help kickstart the economy and deliver the environment we aspire to. That's because ACT is the only party that proposes real solutions to environmental problems, not activism, not slogans. And we're the only party that brings real world experience. People like Nicole and Mark, who've brought their real world experience to the future front bench of the party. We look at data, not at slogans and not at headlines. But we do believe we need more innovation in the primary sector and to solve some of our worst environmental problems. But we don't believe that we need more regulation. We actually need to get smart about how we solve some of these problems. We need to listen to the businesses and the farming communities that have the technology and know the soil science and know about their local environment, because not only do they have the knowledge, but they also have a vested interest in solving some of the environmental problems that underpin success of business. So ACT believes that we should trust those people to come up with the solutions rather than bureaucrats in Wellington. ACT is the party that listens, and that's why we're here tonight. So after I've spoken to you about some other planning and private property rights issues, we're going to have a bit of a Q&A, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions, and I hope we can answer some of those. So before we get on to that, I want to tell you a story, and it's a story about the big difference between ACT and the other parties. It's a story about a dodgy planning law called an SNA. Has anyone here heard of SNAs coming to a town near you? I can see a few people nodding, but I'll explain what it is. It's a planning term that describes a significant or special natural area. And this government has a plan to roll out SNAs across the country, only on private property though. The government and Ministry for Environment call this new rule a national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity. And who wouldn't want more Indigenous biodiversity on their own private property, and places that are special to us on our mountains and in our wetlands and around our coastlines? But I want to tell you the story. A couple of weeks ago, I visited some properties in rural Wainuiomata in the hills behind Wellington. And these were places where local people had cared for their properties, they had planted and they had fenced and they'd carried out their own pest control for decades. One has placed 36 hectares of their property in a QE2 covenant and fenced it to stop the pests coming from dockland onto their land. But I also heard about their plans for their future. Trees for investment, ecotourism, horse trekking, and building houses on sections for their own families and also to support their retirement. And then I heard about how their local council tried to slap an SNA rule on private land in the Hutt Valley. They told me that because the Hutt Council had to schedule some land for development, which meant clearing it, they were looking to offset that by ring fencing other land that had, good, unique natural values on it and stopping development on that land. So they wanted to use private land to offset their own biodiversity destruction. Well, the local community spent some months talking to lawyers about how they could oppose this, and eventually they went to court, and after spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in donated funds and donated time from a law firm, they were able to overturn this very, very bad planning rule. This rule would have seen that families who had cared for their land for generations penalised for their own efforts, while those who slashed and cleared got essentially a clear path to develop their land. No SNAs would have been applied to those bear paddocks. They had a clear pathway to subdivide and develop. Now, that was one battle in what turns out to be a very, very long war for our private property rights. In fact, our fundamental rights, which we've had and essentially taken for granted for over 400 years. Those rights that we won from kings who believed they had a divine right to rule over us. Well, some of those people still live in New Zealand and they belong in this government and they work in Parliament. That's called Ministry for Environment and the Labour Greens government. So look, I've had a look at the cost-benefit analysis around the SNA proposal. What it says is that on some properties, up to 50% of their land will be classified, painted as SNA. And this rules about 20% of one's private property. But you ask, well, why only private property? Why won't these rules apply to Crown land, to council's land, to the dock estate, for example? Well, I'll tell you why. Because it's a massive encumbrance on the use of that land for its intended purposes, whatever that is. I'll give you an example. Auckland Council developed a comprehensive planning document, the Unitary Plan. They spent some years consulting on it. They spent millions and millions of dollars developing it. And it's a plan that sets out how Auckland will grow for the next 50 years and where it can grow. And they included SNAs, significant natural areas, in that plan, but only on council land. because even Auckland Council, with the biggest legal team of any council in New Zealand, knew that it was a fool's game to pick a fight with private property owners by painting SNAs on their land. But they did it for their own land. Well, it turns out that they didn't have a care at all for council's existing asset owners, the people who ran the wastewater treatment plants or the council depots. And it actually has a severe impact on local government's ability to deliver core services. I'll give you an example. Council in Auckland owns a quarry. It's a strategic asset for the city. And in 2005, it was consented for an expansion of the quarry and then a landfilling operation to run there for about 35 years. This is a fundamental strategic asset for Auckland Council. So the consents required them to covenant a large area of native bush and for extensive regeneration and a big buffer zone around the site. At the time, it was considered to be a rather onerous consent, but one that the consent holder would live with because they had this strategic asset that they needed to develop. Well, lo and behold, bit of a surprise, because in 2018, when the quarry operator, who works for council, went to let council, another part of council, know they wanted to clear some trees and start blasting for the last part of the quarry development, they were told, no, you can't. You must get a special SNA consent. And they said, we've got consents from 2006. Well, the planners said to them, you might have those consents, but now you need this new consent. Because apparently the biodiversity planners had ignored all the existing quarry and landfill consents and designations, and they had simply seen something green and just painted it. So that's the same process that Ministry for Environment is going to ask regional councils to take across New Zealand on private property. Well, anyway, council got its consent for its own quarry and landfill, its SNA consent, cost 100 grand, took 8 months, 12 months delay by the time you factor winter in. But nothing changed in terms of the environmental controls and mitigations because council's own planner and the commissioners agreed that everything that could possibly have been done was already taken care of back in 2006. But here's a bill for 100 grand anyway. So if you think that's a problem, this is literally coming to a place near you. It's not really going to affect urban areas too much. It's definitely going to affect rural and regional areas though. So the NPS, the National Policy Statement was drafted by the government last year in 2019. It went out for consultation, and like some of these other laws which have been rushed through under the urgency or under cover of COVID, consultation wrapped up in April. Didn't get a lot of feedback, but the feedback they got from planning consultants and planning lawyers and even the Royal Society of New Zealand was this is a really, really bad idea because it's going to incentivize people in that little window they're going to have between the law passing and the law coming into effect to get the dozers out and blitz a whole lot of places that they've probably cared for quite nicely but haven't quite worked out what they want to do with them yet. So, yeah, entirely predictable, but apparently unintended consequences. So that's likely to happen if a Labour Greens government is elected. But I wouldn't bet any money that a national-led government wouldn't just do the same. Because you've got to remember, back in 1990, when Labour put up the Resource Management Act, they lost the election. National came in and said, it's not such a bad idea, it can't be that bad. They passed it in 1991. Auckland Council's SNA rules also came into effect under a national government in 2015. That's the same national government that went to Paris on a jet and signed the Paris Climate Accord on our behalf. And that's the same national party which voted for the Zero Carbon Act along with Labour. Only ACT and David Seymour opposed the Zero Carbon Act in another one of those 119-to-1 votes in Parliament. So we're offering you a solution. This is why farmers and landowners need ACT to hold the balance of power in any government. And even if we're not in government, to have enough people sitting on the crossbenches to do the hard work that Nicole and Mark have talked about and holding a ruling party to account. Because ACT stands up for good public policy. ACT stands up for private property rights. Those are our principles, and we will continue to do that. You've seen what ACT with one MP can do. Imagine Act with 5, 6, 7 or 8 MPs, that's us and Karen, in Parliament and sitting on select committees holding the government to account. ACT MPs working with sector groups to bring the best ideas before government and Parliament and shine a bright light on the worst. So I'll give you one more example before we get to Q&A about why farmers and landowners need ACT in Parliament, more ACT MPs. ACT was the only party to oppose the Zero Carbon Act. That's a law that's overly bureaucratic and very costly, and it gives massive power to one minister, the climate change minister, one of those kings and lords of old. The New Zealand Initiative, which is a pretty smart think tank, said that that law will be the single most expensive piece of legislation ever passed in New Zealand's history. And you're thinking now, how bad could it be? Well, just wait. ACT believes New Zealand must play its part on climate change, but that the rules must be simple to administer. They must be politically durable. In other words, we must all generally agree it's the right thing to do and it's going to work, and it has to be effective, it's going to work. And New Zealand will only prosper if we actually match our environmental goals with actions that actually benefit the environment, right? Because it's a problem. If New Zealand plans to make more significant and tougher emissions cuts than any of our trading partners, or even countries which we compete with. So if we set more aggressive targets, we'll literally impoverish ourselves and we'll push economic activity in some of our main industrial suppliers and raw material suppliers offshore. But ACT has an idea. In place of the Zero Carbon Act and the emissions trading scheme, ACT will introduce a no-nonsense climate change plan which ties New Zealand's carbon price to the average price paid by our top 5 trading partners. That includes Australia, and that also includes China, which currently does not pay anything. It doesn't have a carbon tax, and yet we're expected to compete with them on a level playing field. That will show the world New Zealand is doing its bit, because we are the good guys when it comes to the environment. It's part of our brand. And it's a simple and effective response to climate change at the margins where New Zealand operates. A fraction of a % of the world's emissions come from New Zealand. And yet the way the government has pitched it, you think we could save the world by having a carbon tax, which is currently $5 a tonne. Now, ACT policy protects New Zealand's brand and allows us to compete. It also allows heavy industry and the raw materials producers to stay here in New Zealand, because we need coal to make steel. It's a vital chemical component. In addition to the thermal energy, the heat you need to heat up the raw materials, it's a chemical reagent. You can't make steel without it. You can't make cement without coal, coking coal, for the same reason. And when it comes to natural gas, you can't manufacture urea fertilizer without natural gas. The alternative for New Zealand, if we ran out of natural gas, would simply be we'd be importing the same ammonium nitrate fertilizer that blew up in Beirut a few weeks ago. That would be all we could get, and we'd be price takers and guarantee the price would be high. We also need natural gas to crack the crude oil to make our own petrol and diesel. It's a chemical reagent in a chemical manufacturing process. They don't burn the gas for fun or just to heat up a boiler at Marsden Point. It's actually part of the chemical process. We can't make our own fuel here without it. We would be entirely dependent on imported fuel from countries which have much worse environmental records than we do. So I think we owe it to ourselves and to future generations to actually take responsibility for our emissions, but also make sure that we can compete fairly. So look, ACT's vision is clear. We believe in innovation, not more regulation. We're the only party proposing real solutions. We're the only party that brings real world experience, not slogans and activism and signs to Parliament. We know we have to get smart about protecting the environment while we support businesses and farmers to actually deliver for the economy. And we want those businesses, those private landowners and those farmers to be confident that ACT has got their back and that we'll stand up for private property rights, when traditional parties won't. We also want those people to be confident, those people who vote for ACT to be confident that we will deliver sound public policy and good law to solve real problems. There's a lot more detail about our policies, our environment policy, our firearms policy, and soon our rural policy, which is about to be unlocked. They're going to be on our website. You'll see more about energy and resources in the next few weeks as well. Also on our website, you'll see more about our plans to kickstart the economy, which includes reducing taxes for middle income earners and reducing GST for the next 12 months from 15 to 10% to actually put more money in the pockets of businesses and workers right now, not on a promise and a dangle carrot for years to come. But ACT needs your vote so we can protect your private property rights, and so that myself and Nicole and Karen and Mark can go to Parliament and hold government and other political parties to account and deliver for you. So I urge you to give your party vote to ACT, to send more MPs like David Seymour to Parliament, and so that you can trust us to change the future. Thank you very much.
And everyone here. We've got a viewing audience that's dialed in, and I just want to thank them very much for dialing in and attending tonight. The guys got the camera back there, so there's a viewing audience at home, and I'm reaching out to them and saying thanks very much for being part of the evening. So I'll hand it over to Beth. Thanks, guys online. Cheers.
Thanks, Mark.